Hi, I'm Eric Sokol. I'm going to talk to you about the LTER Metacommunities synthesis working. So our central question is, how do metacommunity dynamics mediate community responses to disturbance across the ecosystems represented in the LTER network? Quite simply, a metacommunity is a network of interconnected communities, and local interactions play an important role in metacommunities. We're determining the community composition of assemblages and patches. So in this case, local interactions among fish influence the community composition of fishes within that pond. But we also need to consider proximity of sites to one another within a metacommunity and infrequent dispersal events of those patches. So a working hypothesis in metacommunity ecology is that the balance of dispersal and local interactions affects emergent properties of the metacommunities. And this was summarized very well in a review by Logue et al. In 2011, where they described three metacommunity characteristics: the level of dispersal of the organisms that make up the metacommunity, the heterogeneity of habitats within the landscape, or heterogeneity of patches in the landscape in the metacommunity, and then also the functional equivalence, or inverse of that would be the functional diversity of the organisms that make up the metacommunity. And so our working hypothesis is that these three different metacommunity characteristics can predict the underlying dynamics of community assembly in the metacommunity, and ultimately characteristics of biodiversity and stability and other emergent properties of the metacommunity. The participants in our working group represent diverse career stages. So we have graduate students, postdocs, and early and mid-career scientists and faculty. And our core working group members are listed here, but we also have a number of individuals one on this slide who contributed greatly to the working group. Our approach includes 4 goals. So our first is to characterize metacommunity stability, so to come up with a metric to describe variability or stability of community composition for metacommunities. Goal 2 is to characterize predictors of stability. So there's 3 axes to look at all 3. And our third goal is to assess how well metacommunity parameters predict stability across data sets. And then lastly, our fourth goal is to use modeling or simulations to conduct a sensitivity analysis and potentially do some forecasting. So our key findings to date include the development of our compositional turnover metric. So this is expanding upon the ideas by Wang and others that were published in Ecology Letters. And so they came up or talked about the ideas of regional variability and local or alpha variability for aggregate metrics such as biomass. And here we're expanding it to talk about compositional turnover. So regional variability in the composition of the species pool. In this case, this top left plot is variability in species composition, where each species is a different color. X-axis is year. We can look at mean alpha variability in community composition for each of the localities in the data set, which is the bottom left panel. And if you divide regional variability by mean alpha variability, we get a measure of synchrony in community composition, or a proxy for synchrony. And generally, as this value is higher or synchrony increases, turnover or change in community composition in all the different patches that make up the metacommunity follow similar trajectories. I'm not going to talk too much about how to actually calculate the metrics here because I don't have time, but the calculations are essentially based off of beta diversity metrics. We applied these metrics to data sets from 20 different data sets from 8 different LTER sites so far. And we're currently working on additional data sets to beef this up to something more like 20 or 25 different LTER sites. In the top left panel, we have gamma variability across the different data sets. On the y-axis, plotted against standard deviation of mean annual temperature. The bottom is alpha variability plotted against variation in temperature. And if we divide the values from these 2 data sets, we get our synchrony metric. And we see an interesting relationship where synchrony in community composition appears to increase with increasing variability in mean annual temperature for freshwater and terrestrial sites. These points on the left here are all marine sites. It'll be interesting to see if this relationship holds as we add data to this. For potential directions, our next step is to think about how to assess meta-community resistance and resilience in response to discrete disturbance events, and if we can predict that based off of the meta-community characteristics. Lastly, I'll just go over some products and outcomes. So our workflow for calculating compositional variability at local and regional scales and that compositional synchrony metric is available at GitHub, but I suggest contacting either me or one of the other working group members if you're interested, because this code is still in development and needs more documentation. Also, we have a number of manuscripts that are close to being submitted. The first is led by Nicole Volker, who's a recently graduated PhD from the University of Maryland, Baltimore County. That is about novel insights to be gained from applying meta-community theory to long-term biodiversity data. The second paper, which is led by Thomas Lamy, is the paper that describes our compositional turnover and synchrony metrics. The third will be our meta-analysis paper. I want to highlight our collaboration with EDI, and EDI has been very helpful for both us and other LTER synthesis groups. They've come up with a standardized data model for biodiversity data, and also they've created an R package that has some data discovery functionality that we think will be really cool as it's being developed to help folks that are interested in synthesis science. And then lastly, our final upcoming meeting is November 2018, where we'll be looking at forecasting and modeling meta-community stability in future climate scenarios. Thank you for your attention.